Hi, my name is Val Chapin. This is my first podcast. I've created this channel to share my opinions with the larger audience than my family and friends. And today I'd like to talk about inflation. In this podcast, I will refer to United States situation, but more or less as the same situation around the world. Inflation affects everybody's lives. At the same time, majority of people didn't experience high inflation before, and there is a lot of misunderstanding and confusion about it. I guess psychologically, people tend to judge current events based on prior experiences, and people tend to think that everything will get back to normal. My experience helps me to think otherwise. I lived through the period of hyperinflation during the collapse of Soviet Union. It was unexpected but predictable. I lived in Belarus until 1994, and Belarus was part of Soviet Union. Then I moved to New York City, and I worked on Wall Street for major financial corporations as a software developer. Now I live in Canada, in Edmonton. I'm a small business owner now. This is my background, but let's get back to inflation. We'll discuss hyperinflation later. First, let's get to the basics. But first, we need to define what inflation is. The classical definition of inflation says that inflation is the increase in money supply. But most of the people refer to inflation as increase in prices of goods and services. For simplicity's sake, we'll use latter definition of inflation. I will refer to inflation as increase in prices for goods and services. So how inflation occurs and why? Milton Friedman was saying inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon in the sense that it is and can be produced only by a more rapid increase in the quantity of money than in output. End of quote. This means if the quantity of money increases faster than the quantity of goods and services produced, that situation will always lead to inflation, and this is the only reason for inflation. And that was always true regardless what is used as money. For example, when Christopher Columbus discovered America, they found a lot of gold. That led to inflation in Spain. The prices for goods and services in terms of gold rose up. It's amusing, but in 17th century, tobacco leaves were used as legal tender. In Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina, you could pay your taxes with tobacco leaves. So the tobacco leaves were used as money. And at some point, the quantity of tobacco leaves in the system went up so much that the prices in terms of tobacco leaves went up 40 times. And those states had to stop to use tobacco leaves as money. Sometimes the amount of money in the system can stay the same, but quantity of goods and services can go down. And it's also inflationary situation. One example is war. Another example is pandemic. During COVID-19 pandemic, not only quantity of goods and services went down because of lockdowns, but at the same time, quantity of the money in a system was increased significantly. That is one of the reasons why we have a current inflation. So what causes the supply of money to increase? There are two contributors to the supply of money. First, banks, and second, governments. So how bank can increase money supply, or how bank can create money? Because of fractional reserve banking. What does it mean? That means if you deposit $1,000 to your bank is required to hold only $100, and it can loan $900 to somebody else. And this $900 loan to somebody else will be the money newly created. So why banks currently create a lot of money? The reason lies in the interest rates. So current rate of inflation, or so-called CPI, is 8.6%. And this is not the most accurate number because government of United States uses different kind of methodology to make it lower, to make it look good. Producer price index is more honest gauge, and currently it stands at 10.8%. But if you go to Shadow Government Statistics website, shadowstats.com, created by John Williams, you will see an interesting data there. What John Williams is doing, he uses the same methodology to calculate CPI that was used in 1980 or in 1990. And you can see that if you use the same methodology of CPI calculation as the US government used in 1980, then the current inflation in the United States is 16.8%, which is much higher than the official CPI. But even if we use official CPI, we'll say the inflation rate is about 9%. But the interest rates for borrowing, either commercial borrowing or personal borrowing, are lower than the inflation rate. So if you borrow money today, your real interest rate, which is your interest rate adjusted for inflation, is negative. So that means you are rewarded for borrowing. So I'll give you an example. For example, you borrow $100, and the interest rate on this loan is 5%, and inflation rate is 10%. And in 1 year, you made a profit of $20. But because of inflation, at the end of the year, you will have $130. $20 of your profit, $10 because of inflation, because everything increased in price, and the total is $130. You will pay $100 of principal back, you will pay your interest $5, and you will end up with $25. $20 of your profit, and you will get a reward of $5 for borrowing. And you got, not only you got your loan for free, free means the cost of the borrowing was free, but also you're rewarded by inflation. In this kind of situation, when the cost of borrowing is cheap, but not only cheap, but also negative, the amount of debt in a system will grow. And this will increase money supply, and inflation will feed on itself. How it's possible to have the interest rates below the inflation rate? Because it doesn't make sense to loan somebody money and charge the interest rate below the inflation rate. Well, because in today's economies, the interest rate is not determined by the markets. Instead, the government sets those rates. And as in most cases, government has good intentions, but the consequences of the government actions are pretty bad. Is it possible to stop inflation? Generally speaking, yes. Not in current situation, in my opinion. I will discuss it later. But it is possible. What you need to do, you need to discourage borrowing and encourage savings. How to do that? The interest rates have to be higher than inflation rate. What Paul Volcker did in 1980 is a prime example of how to fight the inflation. Paul Volcker was a Fed chairman from 1979 until 1987. And inflation in 1980 reached about 15%. And the Federal Reserve interest rate at that time was about 11%. So 11% interest rate couldn't stop inflation of 15%. So what Paul Volcker did, he raised the interest rate to 20%. And only 20% interest rate was able to stop inflation. Older generation remembers mortgage rates at 22%, which seems impossible today. This bold, or I would say heroic, move of the Federal Reserve Bank not only stopped the inflation, but also saved US economy from inflationary depression. In 2 years, inflation rate went down below 3%. So we can see now that if we want to win the fight against inflation, the interest rates have to be higher than the inflation rate. But why it was possible to successfully fight inflation then and impossible now? First, the economies. Economy of 1980 was not yet globalized, and it didn't have that much debt in the system. Today, the economy is global, and the amount of debt in the system is huge. And if the interest rates have to be higher than inflation rate, that means the interest rates have to be 10% or higher. This kind of interest rates will crash the global economy, and no politician is brave enough to do that. But the government debt is even bigger problem. In 1980, US debt was $900 billion. And the government revenue was about $500 billion. So if you increase the interest rate to 20%, then your interest on your debt is 180 billion, 20% out of 900 billion. Well, it's not that simple because there are different durations on the debt, but just for simplicity's sake, let's say it's 180 billion, which will be about third of your government revenue. Today, the total debt of US government is $30.5 trillion. It currently pays about 1.5% on its debt. So it pays about $430 billion in interest. Is it possible for the US government to increase the interest rates to, let's say, 15%, that means the interest payment on the debt will increase tenfold. Is it possible? Not in my opinion. Even if the interest rate will go to 10%, let's say, the interest only, well, not counting the principal payments, but the interest only payment on the US government debt will be more than $3 trillion a year, while the government revenue, annual government revenue, is 4.4 trillion. So it's about 70% of the whole government revenue. Even if the interest rates will go to 3%, which will not affect inflation in any way, but the interest payment on the government debt will double, and this will make the interest payments higher than the military spending of the country. Historically, if the interest payments on the government debt are higher than the military spending, that means the country is bankrupt. And that is why the Federal Reserve will keep the interest rates artificially low. They may raise them somewhat, but not high enough to fight inflation. And that is why it's impossible to fight the current inflation. Some people may say that if the economy goes to recession, then the appetite for borrowing will go down, and the amount of debt in the system will go down, and ultimately money supply will go down. It is true, but the problem is that at the same time, amount of goods and services will also go down. People call this situation stagflation, and extreme case of stagflation is inflationary depression. And in most cases of hyperinflation, we see the economy contracting, the production goes down. If you take a look at the Germany after World War I, or Zimbabwe, or Venezuela, or Soviet Union during the collapse, it's more or less the same situation economy-wise. By the way, if you think that United States or Canada are somehow immune from high inflation or hyperinflation, the laws of physics, let's say gravity, works the same way in Venezuela or Soviet Union or Germany after World War I. The same way the laws of economics work the same way in Venezuela or Zimbabwe or Soviet Union or United States. And inflation does not discriminate against any race or political system or geography. As long as we're talking about hyperinflation, let me just briefly discuss what the hyperinflation is. Some economists are saying that hyperinflation is when the inflation rate reaches a certain number. Let's say when the inflation rate is 20% or 30% or 50%. So that is hyperinflation. In my opinion, in hyperinflation, I would define as psychological state when the majority of population realizes that it's not that just some prices go up, but the value of the money goes down, and it will continue to go down, then most of the people will try to get rid of money and purchase anything that has value. That kind of state is the death sentence to the currency, unfortunately. Let's get back to the second contributor to the money supply, government. Government not only can influence money supply by manipulating the interest rates, it also can inject money into the system directly. How it's done? Government tends to spend more money than it collects in form of taxes. And at some point, there is a budget deficit. And government finances the deficit by borrowing, by issuing government debt in form of government bonds. In United States, they called U.S. Treasuries. We'll call them U.S. bonds. For example, you have a 5-year bond, and you can buy this, let's say, piece of paper, which is U.S. bond, for $100, and the U.S. government promises to pay you 3% or $3 every year during 5 years. And at the end of these 5 years, U.S. government pays you back your $100. We'll use a 5-year duration just as an example. The problem for U.S. government is this inconvenience called market. Because U.S. government can control or fix short-term rates. When we're talking about longer-term rates, then the market forces come in place. If there are not a lot of buyers for this $100 5-year bond, then let's say this piece of paper is sold on the market for $50, for example, instead of $100. Then not only U.S. government gets less money, but the actual yield or actual interest that it pays on this bond is 6%, because it sold the piece of paper for $50 and it still have to pay $3 a year. That will constitute 6% on the borrowing. That means when the bond prices go down, the interest that government pays goes up, and vice versa. But the government cannot afford high interest rate. What government does? The government implements so-called quantitative easing program, or so-called QE. How it works? U.S. Treasury issues U.S. bonds, and Federal Reserve Bank purchases those bonds on the market, driving the prices of the bonds higher and the interest rate on the bonds lower. Where Federal Reserve gets the money from to buy the bonds? Well, it creates this money out of the thin air. Well, the idea is that the Federal Reserve puts these bonds on the balance sheet temporarily, and at some point of time, it will get these bonds back to the market. By selling the bonds to the market, the money that were created before will be destroyed. So that's the idea. We'll see how that will work, but currently U.S. government has about $5.8 trillion of U.S. treasuries on its balance sheet. So that's how the money supply grows, by artificially lowering the interest rate and by direct injection of the money into the system. Also, I'd like to point out that inflation is not caused by the supply chain problems, but it's the other way around. Inflation causes supply chain problems. I'll give you an example. I live in Edmonton, and let's imagine that we will give $10,000 to each person in Edmonton. In a couple of days, we will see a big supply chain problems in Edmonton. There will be not enough TV sets or washing machines or cars, not enough trucks to deliver the goods to Edmonton, not enough containers, and the prices will go up. And everybody will think that, well, when the supply chain problems will be resolved, then the prices will go down. Well, in a small local case that may be true, because goods from all over the place will flood Edmonton because you can sell goods at a high price in Edmonton. But if it's a global phenomenon, if the money supply grows fast in every corner of the world, because the governments around the world compete who will print more money, then the supply chain problems will persist until the inflation problem is resolved. So as we can see, there are two causes of inflation: artificially low interest rates and direct printing of the money by the government. But we have to understand that the root cause of the inflation is always government spending. We, the people, ask government to spend more and more on social programs, on infrastructure, on other conveniences of life. But at some point, government is not able to collect enough money by taxation, and it goes into debt. And when the government is not able to pay for this debt, then this debt is paid by inflation. And then everybody is affected by inflation, and the standard of living goes down. That is why you can say that inflation is a form of taxation, but it's a hidden form of taxation. Your actual taxes is not what you pay every year, but what government spends every year. And if you didn't pay it in form of taxes, you will pay it in form of inflation. At the end, I'd like to mention that inflation is a serious and dangerous disease of the economy. It has a potential to disintegrate the society. But I'm an optimist, and I think that if we'll have to go through certain economic stresses, then we'll have a better system at the end, and we will have a better life on the other side of this canyon.